My external surroundings are beautiful beyond expectation, C.S. Lewis told his father in a letter just a few days after moving into his rooms at Magdalen College's new building. That was in October 1925. For the next 30 years, this would be where Lewis would prepare his lectures, hold student tutorials, and meet with his friends. Oxford's College of St. Mary Magdalene was founded in 1458. New building behind me was given its name after being completed 3 centuries later in 1733. So it was right here that Lewis was given a suite with a large sitting room which looked out over a deer park. He had a smaller sitting room and a bedroom. Those are 2 windows behind me that looked out over this broad manicured lawn to the college's main buildings.
You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England.
I gave in and admitted that God was God. The former Oxford atheist had come a long way, but what had brought Lewis to such a radical change from his former views? One way to answer this question is to simply say, as Lewis does, that God had been pursuing him steadily and unrelentingly. And one of the most important ways that God had pursued him was through the books that he read. Books by writers such as George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, and George Herbert. Lewis liked these authors for their wisdom and good sense in spite of what he considered to be their archaic Christian mythology. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis warns readers,
"A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of its reading. There are traps everywhere."
One of those traps was sprung on an afternoon shortly before Lewis yielded to God. Lewis was headed home on the top of a double-decker bus driving up Headington Hill. Sitting alone, not thinking about anything in particular, he was suddenly presented with the notion that he was holding something at bay, intentionally shutting something out. It was as though he was wearing a suit of armor, he later said, and in a moment of clarity, he felt that he was offered a free choice. He could unbuckle his armor or keep it on. He could open the door or keep it shut. Lewis writes that before the bus ride was finished, he'd made the choice to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. There would be more choices and further steps to take as Lewis slowly came to admit that God was God. But the start happened in a calm, dispassionate choice made on the top of a bus going up Headington Hill. A small moment that had huge consequences. He was willing to follow the truth no matter where it might lead, even if it meant that God was God. In this session, we will see, along with Lewis, that atheism proved to be far more restrictive than Christianity. As an atheist, Lewis claimed that most of the human race was fundamentally wrong when it came to the most important questions about the universe and our place in it. When he became a Christian, he could see that when it came to other religions, as in arithmetic, some answers were much nearer to being right than others, and each might contain some hint of the truth.
As a young man, Lewis was an atheist. Why? Well, first of all, he thought this is what modern people believe. Religion is very much a thing of the past. But Lewis also was very, very clear in his own mind that atheism was the simplest way of looking at things. He knew there were alternatives, and he dismissed religion as being out of date, outmoded. He was a thinking young man. This is what everybody else seemed to be thinking. He bought into atheism in a very big way. Lewis fought in the First World War. He was wounded in battle in the British Army, and to him, the suffering of the First World War reinforced his atheism. Look, if there's a God, why doesn't he stop this mess? Why doesn't God intervene to stop all the suffering and pain that we're seeing all around us? And Lewis, I think, found that very compelling at the time. But during the 1920s, when he was a student at Oxford, Lewis began to rethink things. He began to realize that atheism was just too slick, too simple, that in many ways it didn't answer some of the deep questions. Lewis, I think, believed atheism made some kind of sense, but it didn't excite him. It didn't give him a reason to live. It didn't answer the deeper existential questions which were coming to the fore in his life. And he was beginning to realize there was also an intellectual issue. If there was no God, then who was to blame for the suffering of the First World War? And Lewis began to realize that as an atheist, he just dumped all the blame on God, but if there was no God, then the blame had to get dumped on human beings. And Lewis began to realize that atheism didn't have quite the intellectual resilience that he thought. So what were the options? Lewis began to think, look, is there a way of seeing things, a way of making sense of reality which is intellectually convincing, but also existentially satisfying? And Lewis's discovery of Christianity was due to many things. One of them was a conversation he had with J.R.R. Tolkien about the way in which stories give us an understanding of what reality is all about. And Lewis began to realize that if Christianity were true, then it offered a way of making sense of things which was far better than his atheism and also than all the religious alternatives he'd considered. Lewis began to speak about his glib and shallow rationalism as a young man, something that once seemed bold and bright and exciting and yet seemed inadequate when it began to be challenged by the complexity of the world. For Lewis, coming to the Christian faith was about discovering a way of seeing things which really made sense. And sure, there were what Lewis called shadowlands, that is, things that were shrouded in darkness or mist, which you couldn't see clearly. But Lewis realized you could see them far more clearly through a Christian lens than through any other way of thinking about them. Now, of course, for Lewis, and indeed for many of us, one of the most important issues here is the problem of suffering. If Christianity is right, well, how do we make sense of suffering in the world? And Lewis dealt with this question at two times and at two levels. Lewis was really concerned to deal with an intellectual question. How can the Christian faith make sense of suffering? But he began to realize also there was a second question. How can Christianity help me cope with suffering? That's a different question. That's an existential question. And Lewis began to realize that Christianity gave very good answers to both of those questions. He began to engage the first in his very well-known book, The Problem of Pain, which he wrote in 1940. And in this book, Lewis sets out this question. If there is a God, how do we offer an explanation for the existence of suffering in the world? And Lewis gives a very good account of why, as Christians, we can accommodate the reality of suffering inside our way of looking at things. And one of the points that Lewis makes is, I think, extremely important. His argument is that Christianity is unique in its way it approaches suffering. It doesn't just offer cheap explanations. It talks about a God who became incarnate. That is to say, a God who entered into this world of suffering and experienced suffering. And that changes everything. It's not just a way of understanding suffering. It's a way of realizing that Christianity is different in its thinking about God, a God who enters into the world, who experiences suffering in order to redeem us through suffering. But Lewis' experience of suffering took a new turn in 1960. Late in life, Lewis married Joy Davidman, and he loved her enormously. And then she developed cancer. And Lewis began to realize he was going to lose the woman who he loved. And she died in 1960. And Lewis was devastated. And in 1961, he wrote a little book called A Grief Observed, in which he talked about his experience of loss and his reflections on what this meant for his faith in God. And it's a very raw book. It's all about his experience of grief, of desolation at the loss of his wife. And as you read this book, you begin to realize Lewis is experiencing suffering and pain, not so much as an intellectual riddle, but as something that threatens to overwhelm him. He must be able to cope with this. And again, Lewis talks about how his Christian faith, and above all, the idea of a God who bears suffering for us, speaking to him in those moments of grief. Lewis reflects, he says, look, during my wife's final illness, I often found myself saying, I wish I could bear her suffering. I can't bear it, what she's going through. Surely I could take this away from her. Then he began to realize, isn't that exactly what happened in the incarnation? That Christ bore our suffering. And it didn't answer all of Lewis's questions, but it made him realize here was a sympathetic, caring God who entered this world to bear suffering and make it easier for us to cope with it as well. Now, why is this so important? Well, for Lewis, it's important in a number of ways. And here I think is the most important point to make. As a young man, Lewis was looking for a way of thinking, a way of seeing things, which would make sense of the world he saw around him and what he experienced within him. And he knew there were alternatives. There was atheism. There were Eastern religions. There were other non-Christian faiths, and there was Christianity. And Lewis initially dismissed Christianity as out-of-date, irrational nonsense. Atheism was the way ahead. But that was a rather premature judgment. And Lewis began to realize that it was simplistic rather than simple. And he began to realize that the complexity of the world demanded a rich and satisfying way of looking at it if you were going to make sense of it and act meaningfully within it. For Lewis, Christianity was like a lens that brought things into focus. It was like a light that illuminated a landscape so you could see things more clearly and see further than you otherwise could do. Now, Lewis was always clear there are going to be things that we don't fully understand, and maybe suffering's one of them. But Lewis's point is this, that the Christian lens brings things into focus far more effectively than everything else. And Lewis was a Christian not by inclination, but by conviction. He discovered this way of thinking that really made sense of the world around him and his experience within us. So Lewis is saying something I think very, very simple and very, very important. Look, we have intellectual options here. There's atheism, there's Buddhism, there's Islam, and there's Christianity. And Lewis was saying, look, it's not just because of cultural history that I have embraced the Christian faith. I've embraced it because it makes sense, because it gives me the most satisfying way of looking at things than I have ever hoped to discover. And Lewis is not being disrespectful of his earlier atheism or of other religious traditions. He was just saying, I have discovered a way of seeing things which makes sense, which is intellectually and imaginatively satisfying. And in that book of his, Mere Christianity, Lewis is saying, look, here is what I have discovered. It's wonderful. Maybe it's something you'd like to think about as well.
In Surprised by Joy, Lewis reports how in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God. The account he gives surrounding that simple admission is infused with allusions from the New Testament. For example, Lewis refers to the prodigal son who at last came home on his own feet, and to the parable of the great banquet where the master compelled his guests to come in. In Lewis's statement, the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, we hear echoes of the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, where Paul tells us that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men, and the weakness of God is stronger than the strength of men. For Lewis, acknowledging the wisdom of God over his own foolishness was a critical and humbling acknowledgement. Yet, it was only the beginning of Lewis's journey into Christianity. In the opening sentence of the very next chapter in Surprised by Joy, Lewis describes himself as the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. But what had he converted to? Not the fullness of Christianity, but to a form of theism, pure and simple. It would take another 2 years before he would yield to any acceptance of Christianity. So, what was the next step for the new convert to theism? Lewis tells us that he felt morally obligated to make some public statement of his change in beliefs. He writes, I thought one ought to fly one's flag by some unmistakable overt sign. How exactly does a new theist, someone who believes only in God, pure and simple, fly his flag? Well, Lewis began attending weekday morning prayer services right here in the Magdalen College Chapel. He makes a point of telling us that he did this in spite of the fact that he did not yet believe in Christianity. More so, he recognized that the difference between his theism and Christianity was large and not to be taken lightly. So, why would Lewis choose to fly his flag of theism in this way, in what he acknowledges was a mostly symbolic action? In joining those who attended morning prayers here at the college chapel, Lewis would have joined people who shared his belief in God. They were Christian theists, and he was a pure and simple theist. By going to morning prayers, Jack wanted to make it clear to everyone that he was no longer an atheist. In this session, we explored some of the rival conceptions of God which people today may have. They may believe in a God found in nature, but not separate from it. They may believe in a God who is beyond our concept of good and evil. They may believe in the good and righteous God of Christianity, or in no God at all. In our next session, we'll explore the way the Christian concept of God differs from all these other beliefs by claiming that at a specific point in history, God himself landed on this enemy-occupied world in human form to teach us and to suffer and die for us.